Scientists are beginning to realize that there appears to be more to this than we thought. We have such excellent sensor systems that have been developed. You've got the pilots tracking the infrared radar system, and the detection of the events.
But what the military sees with their devices is only maybe 10% of the cases. What about what Whitley Strieber saw?
What I wanted to do was to find out that there was some explanation for this that was normal, a rational explanation. Whatever it is, it's part of being human and part of our world that for whatever reason, we are very reticent to face head on.
Welcome, everyone. Welcome to Rice. My name is Jeff Kreipel, and this is our Archives of the Impossible 2 conference, symposium, mashup. It's great to see you all here. I know a lot of you. So let me begin by saying that we are doomed in a good sort of way. What I mean is that there is no way at all we are going to wrap our heads around this thing, what some have called the phenomena and what I want to call the impossible.
Jeff Kreipel's really one of the world's foremost thinkers on weirdness and the paranormal. His Archives of the Impossible conference was one of the first UFO conferences that I went to, and it was transformative for me. I think that he's really created a space for people who have had strange experiences or who study kind of the outer fringes of human experience. And so as soon as I walked into Archives of the Impossible, I was like, oh my gosh, I found my people.
Going first here, I feel a little bit like the opening band for a weekend music festival. You guys get the Beach Boys. You're really here to hear Janis Joplin and Jimi Hendrix, and knowing a few of you, probably the Grateful Dead, but you got me. We've definitely undergone a kind of renaissance, if you will, over the last 2 to 3 years. Primarily because the US government has shown a lot more interest in this topic. And that, I think, has kept things alive and kept people really interested. The second part of this, though, is that the academic world has really stood up and taken notice. This is something that we really haven't seen on this scale before, of mainstream academic science, mainstream academic scholars saying this stuff needs to be looked at in university settings.
Jeff Kreipel is one of the chief forces within academia today fostering this change. His academic credentials are impeccable. Jeff was formerly the chair of the Department of Religious Studies at Rice. Today, he's an associate dean. And Jeff has opened up a whole intellectual landscape within academia, which previously was very, very limited.
The first thing I want to say or claim is that the impossible constitutes the deepest secret of human creativity and culture. The Archives of the Impossible is named after a book I wrote called Authors of the Impossible. I was in Berkeley, California with a gentleman named Jacques Vallée, and Jacques asked me to help him place his papers and case studies in a university archive because he was becoming concerned about their future.
You know, we live in a world where all computer data is fungible. I have correspondence with 1,000 people around the world studying this problem, going back over 50 years. Shouldn't we save it somewhere?
Jeff Kripal sent me a letter, I guess about 10 or 15 years ago at least. And I thought, how interesting, a professor from a big, prestigious university on the level of Harvard. And suddenly in there is the Archives of the Impossible.
Ed May donated a lot of the remote viewing material. Then Whitley Strieber donated about 5,000 letters. And it just kind of sucked things in from there. Will this collection help future researchers connect the dots?
Are you familiar with the term invisible college?
Well, so first of all, the invisible college is an old term. It arises in the 17th century among British Protestant intellectuals who are studying science. And they know darn well that if they say out loud what they're thinking, they're going to be in big trouble.
Science as we know it really came out of a group of enlightened scientists, most of them noblemen because they had the luxury of their own opinions and their own fortunes behind what they did, who essentially took a position that was somewhat antagonistic to the church position. The position of the church was that many of the phenomena of nature belong to God, and you're not capable of understanding those phenomena. You're not supposed to open somebody's body to look at how their heart is beating. And you're not supposed to ask questions about the stars because the stars are a mystical thing. These physicists and biologists in England conspired to study those things together and to put money behind the research and to start publishing their research independently of the church. And they called themselves the Invisible College.
It was essentially a group of intellectuals who thought and studied things that were not supposed to be thought or studied. In the 1970s, Jacques wrote a book called The Invisible College, and it was about a group of intellectuals and scientists who were studying UFO topics and parapsychological topics.
So that was the new Invisible College because they were a college of researchers that were not publicizing their work. And Dr. Hynek thought that by then there were, maybe 12 or 15 of us in different countries, certainly some of the leaders in French science, biologists like Dr. Chauvin, the physicists like Costa de Beauregard, who worked with Einstein, were vitally interested in the UFO reports, and we were discussing it together. Most of them would not admit publicly onto a TV station and so on, wouldn't come forward and say they were interested in UFOs.
Invisibility is just a kind of code for we're going to do this in a secret fashion because we can do more. These extreme anomalous experiences, which are not supposed to happen but do all the time, lie somewhere close to the well springs of human civilization in its various modes. I consider the project here to be the visible college. I want to make the invisible visible. I want to mainstream it. I want to do it in a much more public and much more explicit way.
Today, more and more philosophers recognize that there are aspects of the mind that even if they are correlated with things that are happening in the body or happening in the brain, that they're not reducible to these things. They are something more. It's amazing to me, honestly, the way that academia has evolved in the last 10 or 15 years. This conference, setting the tone for how people engage with this. One of the really valuable things that Jeff Kripal is doing is providing this very safe place to explore further beyond the bounds of current science and current explanation and try to figure out what is going on.
I'm very grateful that I'm still alive at my advanced stage to see a transition.
You came on my radar when Oumuamua, which is an object that we detected in space that you believe could possibly have been extraterrestrial.
We had a seminar, a lecture about this object at Harvard, and a colleague of mine, after the lecture, said, "This object is really weird. I wish it never existed." You know, that I was really appalled by this. How can you say something like that? You learn something new. It's a learning experience. We learn that we have to revise the way we think about reality, you know. That's a good thing.
Yeah, as somebody who covered national security for so many years, it's fascinating to watch how this issue kind of moved off screen into the middle of the screen.
A former military intelligence officer of 14 years, as well as 2 former fighter pilots, appeared before Congress this week to blow the whistle on UFOs.
The question is, do I think we're up to the task of handling this? Based off of the hearing yesterday and the way it's been performed, I think we are.
I think what's most remarkable is no matter what your viewpoint might be, if you believe the government is hiding aliens, or you believe, you know, the government knows more than it's revealing, we now have U.S. senators stand up and talk about UFOs as a serious policy issue.
Can you just give us some raw numbers of how many UAPs you've analyzed, how many have been resolved, and sort of in what buckets, and then how many are still left to be resolved?
It's opened the floodgates for scientists and sort of, you know, the academy, so to speak, is to take this topic more seriously and not just marginalize it as, you know, oh, that's the tinfoil hat crowd. You know, this is a real scientific question that maybe with all the technology we have today, we can answer, whether the government tells us what they know or not.
I had no interest in this early in my career. I was interested in very typical things that historians and scholars of religion are interested in. In the early part of the millennium, I wrote a book on the California counterculture and a movement that focused in Big Sur around a place called the Esalen Institute. And I met a lot of people, and these people told me some really, really strange stories that I knew couldn't have happened, but I knew happened. Because I knew these people, and I knew they weren't lying. I knew they weren't doing this for any kind of ulterior reason. And I realized that we had no way of thinking about those stories.
In the quiet Mississippi town of Pascagoula, 2 local men confronted authorities with a rather bizarre story. Charles Hickson and Calvin Parker told of a strange craft landing near their fishing site and of being taken aboard by 3 unearthly creatures.
When they carried me inside, they seemed to just lean me back, you know. And this eye, it moved up in front of me about this close. Mm-hmm. And it started right at my eyes, looking me right in the eye. Uh-huh. And it hesitated there for a few seconds, and it just started moving over my entire body.
Sheriff Diamond, can you tell me just what happened that night?
No, sir, I can't. All I can tell you is it was 2 men came in the sheriff's department approximately 8:30 and 9 o'clock. They were all excited, upset.
Tell me about the lie detector test.
These men, in my opinion, believe that they saw this and that they were being honest in reporting what they have reported.
Back then, our only way of thinking about these stories was not thinking about them. Oh, that's that person drank too much alcohol, or that person was on LSD, or that person was hallucinating. I mean, there's just this easy kind of explanations that actually explain nothing. And so I got really interested in why intellectuals don't think about those experiences, which presumably lie at the core of a lot of basic religious beliefs.
I actually liken a lot of this topic to religion because it is very similar to me. I mean, I think there's a lot of commonalities. For many people, the truth is out there and it's very emotional and it's part of their belief system. Just like if you're Hindu or Christian or Jewish or Muslim, I mean, you have a belief system. And I think some people have experienced things, and whether you and I think it's real to them in a real way. And so we can't just dismiss it, especially since it's not like just a few people. You know, there's a lot of people and a lot more coming forward now.
Just right up there, and then it flew like right across over and down that way.
I think paranormal phenomena are essentially the building blocks of what become religion. So things like belief in a separable soul, or immortality, or divination, or the ability to know what's going to happen before it happens. I mean, all these are kind of classical religious ideas, but they're also really common paranormal phenomena. And I think these beliefs develop because people have always had these experiences. I think that's really the bottom line.
Up there, I saw a UFO, and it went down the river, turned right at the United Nations, turned left, and then down the river.
And it looked what sort of?
Silent, and it looked dark, like black or gray in the middle, and there wasn't a helicopter, and it wasn't a balloon, and it was so near.
Has this been a hard transition, exploring this subject matter as an academic?
I teach at Rice. Rice is a very STEM-oriented institution. Most of my undergraduates are going to be engineers or chemists or maybe doctors. They're very science-oriented. And when I started to teach comparative religion here, I was using kind of classical religious texts, and I realized they were dismissing all of them. And they were dismissing them because they would say to themselves, oh, this person doesn't know science.
Well, let's say this Twinkie represents the normal amount of psychokinetic energy in the New York area. According to this morning's sample, it would be a Twinkie 35 feet long, weighing approximately 600 pounds.
That's a big Twinkie.
So I shifted and I started to use the anomalous experiences of scientists and engineers and medical professionals.
Anomalous experiences. In other words, something that science can't explain.
Yeah.
This is essentially what you've termed the flip.
Yeah. A scientist or an engineer is trained in a very materialist worldview where there's only matter, and the mind or consciousness is some sort of accidental byproduct of dead matter behaving in very complicated ways in our brain. So mind is essentially not real. What the flip is when a scientist realizes that, oops, actually mind is fundamental, and matter is actually some kind of expression of mind or consciousness. And so they have this complete flip of orientation, usually from a near-death experience or a psychedelic experience or an illness. I mean, there's a lot of things that will flip an intellectual or a scientist, but once they're flipped, they're flipped. It's hard to get them back to the earlier kind of materialist perspective. My own flip, I was living in Calcutta in 1989. It was the fall of '89. It was during a festival called Kali Puja, which occurs in late October around our own Halloween. You have this goddess with cut off heads and cut off hands and goat sacrifice. And I mean, it's our Halloween, only way, way more. There's a whole elaborate kind of religious worldview wrapped around this as well that I was very familiar with and I was in fact studying. One night I came back late from visiting all these temporary temples in the city, and I fell asleep and I woke up. But my body didn't wake up. It was what, I think a doctor would call a sleep paralysis event. And this energy just kind of came out of nowhere, came out of me, out of the room, out of somewhere, and started to interact with me in very conscious, very intentional ways that were not me. It was not me. And it was not subtle. I thought I was being electrocuted. I thought I was having a heart attack. Maybe I was. But it was powerful. And it resulted in it kind of imploded into my chest region, and the experience was I left my body and I floated to the top of the ceiling in a kind of dream landscape. I just felt like, to use a later language that did not exist in 1989, I felt like, something had been downloaded into me. It was just like, oh my God, there's something in me now.
I grew up in a religious atmosphere as a child. I had an Orthodox bar mitzvah. There was always an unspoken quality of faith in the household. And I think probably from a very young age, I had an instinct that there was reality in the extra-physical. I had occasional experiences myself involving things like prayer or astrology or tarot readings. And I suppose that my chief interest was in discovering how some of this ancient material had endured across centuries and even millennia. The Neanderthals themselves, quite literally, had their own system of spirituality. They had talismans, they had figurines, they had devotional practices and paintings, and we're talking about the most primeval origins of humanity. So this is obviously something that goes far beyond what we today would call credulity. It's baked into the human experience.
When people claim they know what this is about, whether it's some kind of fraud or it's some kind of mechanism, I'm like, my eyes just roll. I'm like, you either don't know what you're talking about or you're lying. For me, Jacques Vallée is the barometer. I love Vallée's work because it combines the sciences and what I would call the humanities in really effortless ways.
Jacques Vallée has a broader viewpoint that maybe it isn't just ETs coming from some galaxy far away. The idea that, it's just a spacefarer wandering around through the galaxy and happens to take a look at us, that doesn't really quite match the data. There are hundreds of sightings every year going back millennia, which is a point that Jacques really goes out of his way to make.
I think Jacques flipped somewhere in the late 60s. I think it actually happened in libraries in Paris. And he was reading folklore around fairies and demonology and sort of medieval folklore, and he realized that these stories were essentially about what we call UFOs today, and that there was definitely a connection between the old folklore and occultism and the modern mythology that's really developed around the UFO in the modern world.
Open your Bible. What is it that Ezekiel saw? Ezekiel describes a craft, a material craft, with entities that made a tremendous impression on him and abducted him. He woke up on top of a mountain, some miles away, and he didn't know what had happened to him. And he described wheels within wheels.
Ezekiel gives us this account of the engineering, the architectonics of this object are unfathomable and enigmatic, and suddenly we're required to interpret what the hell this means.
The Bible has preserved it as a religious experience. Well, what was it?
In the early books of the Old Testament, that's really the critical first framing. In terms of the story of imagining ourselves into a time when our ancestors understood extraordinary experiences as everyday. And Jacques Vallée, in his Wonders in the Sky, gives us a great chronicle, for instance, of aerial phenomena through the ages.
There's some excellent events from Egypt millennia ago where, two armies are fighting and suddenly there's craft in the air that come down and help one side versus the other. They imagined that they were the gods coming to save their skins. The evidence for that kind of thing is scattered throughout our literature in all different countries, so it isn't just a Western thing.
We don't have the complete map, but we have 19th century observations by astronomers. And in those days, there was no stigma attached to it. This was, the wonders of science with everything documented, including some wonderful engravings from Germany and from England and from France and so on, of tic-tacs. That's straight out of a fairy tale. I mean, if you read this without knowing the context, you'd say it's another fairy tale. It turns out fairy tales come from folklore, and they are based on real observations. In the 17th century, if you were to tell a story like that, the priest would say you were in contact with the devil. It could only have been the devil. And you would suffer the consequences. So people in those days, it would filter into folklore, into cute stories you'd tell the kids. Okay? This has been very deep in human history. We just don't pay attention to it.
We're at the very beginning of a time where it's going to be feasible to ask these questions seriously without the giggle factor, without the discomfort, without what must be for some people spiritually unsettling. The idea that some of these scenarios may defy our conventional understandings of our religious traditions. We have a bigger toolkit now than we ever had before in terms of both the empirical end of the studies, the kinds of instruments we can use in terms of examination of the physical world.
I also brought a few things, in terms of what samples look like. Pieces of things people have picked up after a UFO case.
Jacques, in discussing, he started talking about some of these materials that he had from UAP. Wait a second, I never knew about this. There's actual materials that people have. I can look at those. That's something that a scientist can do.
These are materials that I have collected with different teams in Brazil, data from 50 years ago.
There was a series of sightings reported in Brazil in 1957. These are from the most famous, I guess. The account of an explosion over a resort beach called Ubatuba.
The Ubatuba materials, those two vials that have Muestra A and Muestra B sample in Spanish. What's good about these materials is that they have a chain of custody. So I said, okay, well, as it turns out, some of the instruments that I've developed in my laboratory for the biology that we do are actually designed to look at metals. I had all this instrumentation available to do the work, and no, I'm not a metallurgist. I'm not going to claim things about metal structure that I don't know, but I can at least tell you what's there. One of the samples showed isotope ratios of magnesium which were way off Earth normal. Now, that doesn't mean it's from an ET. It just means that somebody altered the isotope ratios. But at the time these things were found, that would have been a multi-million-dollar operation. And it doesn't sound like something you would go throwing around a beach in Brazil.
Your work with Dr. Nolan, is it to show leadership in the scientific community on the UFO, UAP issue?
I just admire Dr. Nolan and his work. I mean, obviously his work in biology and medicine is exceptional. But I admire his willingness to jump into this and assemble a new generation of scientists to look at the accumulated data. We've already published, as you may know, the sophisticated analysis of data from an unidentified UFO case.
Council Bluffs, Iowa, 77.
At Council Bluffs on Saturday, December 17th at 7:45 p.m., 3 people traveling towards North 16th Street noticed a reddish object about 600 feet in the air falling straight down.
An object was seen hovering. Multiple people saw it from several different vantages. Something bright seemed to drop from it.
It disappeared behind the trees of Big Lake Park, followed by a huge flash of blue-white light with 2, quote, arms of fire shooting in the air as if it had crashed.
They thought it was a plane crash.
One eyewitness said, quote, it looked like a great big sparkler with lava-like material dripping, appearing to slow as it cooled. Now another young couple saw, quote, a big round thing hovering in the sky below the treetops, and they called the fire department.
Upon arriving, they find a pool of liquid metal. The police arrived, took Polaroids, which I have, and then large pieces of the material were recovered by some of the witnesses. There were a lot of potential explanations for it, all reasonable. Things like thermite, et cetera, and they were all discounted based on the evidence. It wasn't a meteor crash, because meteors don't leave pools of molten metal behind, they leave holes. Again, there's a story, there's witnesses, there's police validation that at least the story is all comported, and then there's material evidence.
As you can see, this one comes from Council Bluffs in Iowa, which is a paper we published.
Jacques brought me the material evidence. Now, I analyzed it with one of my machines. We published a peer-reviewed paper. The only thing we found about it was that it was inhomogeneous. It's a fancy way of saying incompletely mixed. Material shows no sign of technology. The material is clearly the result of an industrial process, and it was incompletely mixed. Okay, so why? Again, that's the question you ask all the time when you see data. It's like, why? Why would you do it? What could have generated it? And why would you dump it in the middle of a field in a small farming town in Iowa?
Is this really what the Soul Foundation? Tell me about the Soul Foundation. What is the purpose?
Right. Well, the purpose of the Soul Foundation is to legitimize the subject matter and to bring a level of discourse that's professional. Academics, for all of its flaws, has a methodology that it uses which involves proving something to a level of acceptability through peer review. Now, peer review doesn't mean it's right. We're saying, here's the kinds of questions we need answers to. We need a white paper on this, or we need something published in the literature that examines this problem.
Just in the year and a half or so that I've become active and have started interviewing people, I have met dozens of people who, commercial, military, Coast Guard, mariners, and submariners who have had observations. This is several dozen people that have seen phenomena in our oceans in the tropical, eastern, western Pacific, the Gulf of Mexico, the Caribbean, the Mediterranean, and the Indian Ocean, and the North Atlantic and eastern seaboard. So this is happening. I love my job in the Navy because every part of the Navy needs to know something about the physical environment. The Marines or the Army, they use a term, they talk about high ground and taking high ground, because high ground gives some tactical advantage over an opposing force. There is a high ground in the ocean, and that's what I gave the U.S. Navy. Having knowledge of the physical characteristics of the sea surface as well as the ocean volume will help determine how well your sensors perform, whether they be acoustic or optical or radar. And so knowing where we could basically see the adversary and they could not see us, giving detailed information about the ocean structure was basically providing high ground to the naval forces I supported.
Do we have any sensors underwater to detect on submerged UAPs? Anything that is in the ocean or in the seas?
So I think that would be more appropriately addressed in closed sessions.
Okay.
July 15th, this thing dipped into the water, and that sent the crew into sort of a routine. They announced something to the effect of splash, splash, which marked the spot where the thing went in. They conducted a search looking for wreckage. There was none there. It disappeared from sonar and radar, and this thing was just gone.
What is a USO?
That's the term people are using for UFOs in the water, that unidentified submerged object. I think USOs have been observed since at least the 60s, and there are some books and reports that have been published since then. And now we're seeing really a more attention towards the topic. Carl Feit is one of those who has published a book on that. And now more recently, Richard Dolan is publishing a compendium of all the reports of USOs, and he's let me review that for him. We're seeing in the oceans the same kind of phenomena that's in the atmosphere in our skies, where different types of craft and different shapes like triangles and discs and elongated cylinders. We're seeing different lighting configurations like you see with UFOs. And we're seeing basically activity and characteristics that defy the laws of physics as we know them. And when I say we're seeing, these are the reports that eyewitnesses have come forward with.
Multiple witnesses report seeing a large blue object fall out of the sky and into the ocean.
Or the line in the water, whatever it is.
She described it as being larger than a telephone pole and says she never heard it make any sound.
The idea of the space and ocean comparison is interesting to me. There is a famous astronaut named Scott Carpenter who I got to meet, and I asked him, how do you compare the two? And he'd said, oh, space is just glorious. It's bright, it's shiny. You launch on the top of a rocket, and it's very fast, and you get these missions done quick, and they're brilliant. And then he kind of paused for like a dramatic effect, and he said the ocean is cruel, and it's cold, everything breaks in it, and it's just difficult. We've only explored about 5% of the ocean's volume. Think about that. 95% of the ocean's never even been examined. And so when you think about it, if we're just seeing a little bit in the areas of the ocean we're looking at now, in terms of USO activity, what might we be missing? It could be quite a bit.
We're going to have to somehow wrap our minds around the fact that the scientific method that is directed toward the physical world isn't complete. There has to be another level of methodology that somehow enables us to accurately address this numinous level of reality. And that is going to be a very interesting journey, because I have a feeling it's not going to involve detection with instruments as we now understand them.
What do you think it's going to involve?
I think that those instruments will be as much part of us as they are part of the world around us. And I don't want to speculate. I was a science fiction author, but I'm not now.
The accounts of experiencers, from my perspective, are testimony. And over time, testimony becomes a record. people will sometimes dismiss testimony as anecdote, which is actually a term that's intended to be disabling. But we use testimony all the time. We use it in medicine to try to understand under what conditions a person experiences pain, or under what conditions is that pain alleviated. Therapists and patients use testimony commonly to prescribe psychopharmacological drugs and so forth. We use testimony to measure the efficacy of those drugs. So testimony is a common source of information in the sciences as it is elsewhere. Over time, testimony becomes record, and that's part of what's happening in our time.
Most people that have had anomalous experiences don't want to talk about them. They don't want to shout about it from the rooftops. They're not looking for publicity. They just want to talk with other people that have been in similar situations, and they want to do the research so that they can figure out some more clues to these enduring mysteries. The Experiencer Group is a community site for people that have had anomalous experiences of any and all kinds. So that can mean people that have had UFO encounters with non-human intelligence. There are people that have had out-of-body experiences, near-death experiences, precognition. We find that folks that have had one type of experience, sometimes, the quiet secret is that it's more than one modality that they've actually experienced.
You sit down and you read letter after letter after letter, you realize that this is something marvelous that we've discovered about ourselves. People will sit down and write a detailed, long letter about something that really happened to them that is the central question in their life.
There's a strong association with fear and the shame and the hiding that people feel when they can't talk about anomalous experiences. And then it's also important to remember that there are other experiencers that seem to have lucked out, and it's just all cosmic high fives the entire time, right? Just in the last 9 months alone, we've organized 3 hybrid conferences that happen online and in New York City, featuring people like Gary Nolan, Leslie Kane, Ralph Blumenthal, Christopher Mellon. That has been incredibly fruitful for small group work, to be able to have luminaries like that be coming into the situation and engaging with other experiencers. One situation that I recall that really helped unlock recognizing that I needed to deal with my history with anomalous phenomena was a situation where I was in Miami for a wedding with my ex-wife, and we had a shared experience where I was looking out the window of this high-rise that we were in, and there was an illuminated swimming pool down below. I was looking at it, and for some reason, about 5 or 6 stories down, between where I was and the pool, there was this ball of electricity that just appeared out of nowhere exactly where I was looking. And I just thought, uh-oh, this is not good. And seemingly this ball, maybe it was about the size of a basketball or so, it started slightly moving and growing in size towards where I was. I called my wife over, and she saw it out the window. And right as she saw it, it moved very quickly towards our position. And she turned around to run away from it. And as she did, she was seemingly rendered unconscious. And I had to move to grab her head so it didn't hit the floor on our way down. And when I turned around, there were 2 non-human entities. And strangely, I know it sounds very weird, they were standing outside the window in some way, as if there was some overlapping realm that they were on. And as had happened at other times in the past, I was somehow moved over to kind of an operating theater. And I was laid down on a slab that was seemingly levitating. And there was some kind of medical procedure happening. And I woke up in the morning with part of my suit still on top of the covers in the bed, and my then wife was just staring at my face. She had already woken up. And I was like, "Can we talk about this?" She was like, "No, we can't talk about this." And I realized that that relationship was not going to work. And I realized that the way that I was handling this stuff was not going to work. Because denying that it was happening or acting like I wasn't an experiencer didn't make it go away. And so I had separated from my wife, and I started researching these subjects. And now, here I am, about 12 years later.
Here's the thing people don't understand. When I talk about revelation, for example, which is a religious notion, what I mean is the person doesn't make up the story. The story appears to the person. It's passive. The person is shown something. It's not the dreamer or the visionary or the near-death experiencer that's making some shit up. That's not what's happening. Something is happening to the experiencer or the person being shown to them, and that's why they'll say it was a revelation. They're not sitting around daydreaming and, making up something, fantastic in my mind. That's not it at all.
The first time that I encountered Whitley Strieber's work was the film adaptation of Communion. I was probably 14 or 15 years old, flipping channels, and then shock and amazement that I saw a being on television that was close enough to what I had seen when I was younger. And I remember being perplexed, a sense of panic that I couldn't really identify the source of. And I remember the visual of seeing Christopher Walken playing Whitley Strieber and him being severely troubled, working with a therapist. And I remember turning off the television at that point. I think I wasn't ready to engage with the idea that as an adult, I would have to be doing similar work as what I was seeing in that scene. I didn't want to engage with that yet.
People really responded to that because they thought, well, wait a minute, this is very much like what happened to me. And the face on the cover, I sat beside the artist, Ted Jacobs, who drew that face and described my memories in great detail. And that face is pretty much what I remembered. It's a very complex human experience, and like so many other people, couldn't let it go.
What I remember is that through my wall came some beings around my bed, and I ran between them and ran out of the room into my mother's room to hide from them. And what happened is they followed me in there, and that's the last I remember of it. However, it's interesting because after that, I never told anybody about that, and I just buried it in the back of my mind. And me and my brother, we never even spoke about it.
The abduction process, which is what I experienced, is only a small part of our relationship with whatever they are.
I think Whitley is a hero. I think Whitley Strieber is such a brave, courageous, and an important figure in this field. It can be hard to figure out how to approach Whitley Strieber. The gravity around him in interpersonal situations is very strong. I remember meeting him for the first time and having to walk away. I remember the first time in meeting Whitley that I actually had to walk away and go to the bathroom so that I could cry and come back. He's used to people saying thank you to him. But I can't thank him enough.
Annie put it one day, she was reading all these thousands of letters we got pouring in, and she comes out of her office and says, Whitley, this has something to do with what we call death. And, you know, we're way beyond the alien abduction idea at that point. I can't tell you what's going on, but I can tell you this. If we ever figure it out, it's going to change the world.
Probably every 2 or 3 months, I would hear fairly compelling stories of near-death experiences or shared death or after-death communications that should have gotten my attention. But I kept dismissing them, thinking, no, that's wishful thinking. We don't have any way of proving that. No, we don't seem to have memories of past lives. I don't know that I believe in reincarnation. Certainly having my own personal experience went light years towards opening me up to accepting and admitting this beautiful kind of expansion in our knowledge of ourselves and the universe. There came a slowly spinning white light, and this white light had fine silvery and golden tendrils, and it came towards me, very slowly spinning. And as it did so, I realized that it came with a perfect musical melody. And in the core realm, I was told, you're not here to stay. We'll teach you many things. You'll be going back. So why was it that I had the most profound, rich, detailed spiritual experience when my brain was most demonstrably off? That was part of the mystery I was to answer over these 15 years since that time.